It's Australia's National Fossil Day, and today we are highlighting one of the most important and completely forgotten men to have ever explored this ancient land. He was an Englishman who not only did cool scientific stuff like discover ancient life forms and explore Australia decades before Captain Cook. Did I mention that guy was a real pirate? In Australia, many might know the name, they just are rarely sure why. But the achievements William Dampier accomplished during his lifetime were astonishing, and it's incredulous he's not a household name. After a short career in the Royal Navy, in 1673, Dampier moved to the British colony of Virginia, where he lived amongst possums and raccoons. Here, he joined an American privateer sailing for the Pacific with a fleet that, at one point, numbered 10 ships to attack the Spanish in Mexico, Peru, and even the Galapagos Islands. Dampier would use these islands as a base of operations for years to come, meaning over a century before Darwin, there was a British naturalist clambering over the Galapagos, recording its mysteries. In Mexico, his American captain died, and Dampier transferred to the Signet, captained by Charles Swan. They immediately headed west across the Pacific to raid the East Indies and visit Manila, China, the Spice Islands, and an odd stretch of land that had been charted by the Dutch some years before, called New Holland. In 1688, the Signet beached for repairs along the coast of West Australia, giving Dampier a chance to explore and take notes on this bizarre new world. He recorded the few natives he saw were the miserablest inhabitants of the earth, and the region's soil was poor and the plant life small. 80 years before the Endeavour arrived in Botany Bay, Dampier was the first Englishman to walk on Australian soil and study its fauna and flora. In fact, Joseph Banks, during the Endeavour voyage, had Dampier's published books and maps to help guide him. Without Dampier's work, the future British exploration of Australia may not have been as successful or possible even attempted at all. The pirate's adventures not only inspired Cook's journeys to Australia, vicariously it led to the French expeditions of discovery to the region as well. Destitute, Dampier returned to England in 1691. However, the pirate was about to become rich thanks to the one thing he did manage to bring home, his journals. In 1697, Dampier published his work and maps in a book called New Voyage Round the World. The book was a huge hit and ignited England's thirst for travel books of exotic places, inspiring a new generation of writers and explorers including Defoe, Swift, Coleridge, Cook, Banks, and Humboldt. His books led to the Buccaneer being offered a Royal Navy warship, the HMS Roebuck, so he could return to New Holland and continue his exploration. This was England's first scientific voyage of discovery, opening the way for all those to follow. Things, however, did not go smoothly at first, as his second-in-command, Lieutenant George Fisher, feared the old pirate intended to simply steal the king's ship and return to his old way of life. It certainly didn't help that Dampier insisted on bringing some of his old shipmates on board to help crew the ship. During the passage to South America, the two men clashed constantly, and Fisher made his feelings very clear on the ex-pirate's shady past. Dampier, in turn, left Fisher jailed in Brazil for insubordination and possibly for conspiring to mutiny. While his crew rested, and hopefully the troubles of the voyage dissipated, Dampier took to the countryside with his notebooks and started collecting. The pages of these books soon filled with the drying leaves and flowers he came across on his excursion, along with pages filled with his observations. One important scientific comment he recorded was when he noted that different groups of birds seemed to be actually related, and thus subspecies. When the naturalist released his book on the Roebuck voyage, this would be the first time the phrase subspecies had ever been published. On August 7, 1699, the Roebuck arrived off the West Australian shore at a wide cove Dampier named Shark Bay, after all the deadly predators patrolling its waters. About 2 in the afternoon, we saw the land ahead that makes of the bay, and before night we had again shoalings from that shore, and therefore shortened sail and stood off and on all night. The voyage had been a long one, and his men were tired. In the morning, they moved into the bay, and we cut good store of firewood at this first anchoring place, and my company were all here very well refreshed with raccoons. The men hunted while Dampier ran through the fields of pretty wildflowers, collecting as many as he could. He noted many of his discoveries down, including the fact that one of the larger, toothier sharks his crew caught was, quote, 11 feet long, the space between its eyes was 20 inches, and 18 inches from one corner of its mouth to the other. Its maw was like a leather sack, and so tough that a sharp knife could scarce cut it. Within it was found the head and bones of a hippopotamus, the hairy lips of which were still sound and not putrefied, and the jaw was also firm, out of which we plucked a great many teeth, as big as a man's thumb. This is one of the first descriptions of an Australian shark, and it apparently had the remains of a hippopotamus in its belly, likely the remnants of a dugong or sea cow. The former pirate also apparently collected the first bryophyte to come from Australia. These are part of the oldest land plant family ever, dating back nearly 500 million years. More importantly, his immediate concern was to find water as their reserves were low. Like the Dutch before him and the future French explorers that would follow years later, Dampier and his men were facing one of the most desolate, hostile stretches of coastlines in the world. The Roebuck moved about the enormous bay, investigating every feature they could see, but finding no viable water source, the Roebuck was forced to sail north for the Dutch East Indies. Leaving the bay that afternoon, we came to an anchor once more near two islands and a shoal of coral rocks that face the bay. There are indeed two islands sitting in the mouth of Shark Bay, Doré and Bernier, and they have created one of the most important biological sites in the world. The bay itself is at the focal point of three different climatic regions: the cool waters coming up from Antarctica, the warm waters of the northern Indian Ocean, and the bay itself, which contains an extensive forest of seagrass on its floor. The Warramel Seagrass Bank is the largest in the world and is home to over 10% of the world's dugongs, which in turn may explain why there are so many sharks in the region. Bizarrely, this is also one of the few places in the world where you can see tool use by a marine mammal. The local bottlenose dolphins have acquired the habit of placing a marine sponge on their beak to protect it while it digs in the sandy sea floor for prey. The islands help block the bay's mouth from the oceans beyond, creating a safe haven for ships and animals inside. These islands and the sandbank where the seagrass forest is has created an abnormally high saline water system at the south of the bay. The waters have little access to the surrounding Indian Ocean, meaning its water becomes more and more salty over time, creating one of the most unique ecosystems in the world. A shoal of coral rocks. There's around 80 species of coral in Shark Bay, as well as something that, if you didn't know what it was you were looking at, could be considered coral. At a place called Hamlin Pool at the southern end of the bay are large black stone structures that are clearly visible at low tide. Dampier sailed along this part of the coast, but, quote, appearing barren, I did not strive to go nearer it, and the rather because the winds would not permit us to do it without much trouble, and at the openings the water was generally shoal. I therefore made no farther attempts in this part of the bay. These strange stones, however, are not coral, but something far, far older. The age of algae. In many ways, the continent of Australia can be considered a living ark, an island of prehistoric creatures that simply should not be, and the oldest and most astonishing of these can be found in Shark Bay. Dating back at least 3.5 billion years, stromatolites are the concrete-like structures secreted by mats of cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. It was this early microscopic life that absorbed much of the planet's carbon dioxide and expelled oxygen as a byproduct. Stromatolites were so numerous and did this job so well they created the oxygen-rich atmosphere we enjoy today, and all but poisoned themselves into extinction. Though it's unclear, the strange shoals that Dampier describes is one of the few places in the world where you can walk amongst some of these ancient life forms. World famous for its stromatolites, Dore and Bernier Islands also hold one of the rarest creatures in the world, a marsupial far older than the Ice Age. While mammoths and saber-tooths were wandering the northern hemisphere, Australia had its own unique megafauna. And for more on the first discovery of Australian megafauna, check out our first National Fossil Day tour video on the Wellington Caves. Modern kangaroos once had a close cousin group, the short-faced kangaroos or strethorines. Some of these were the tallest marsupials ever, like Procoptodon, and their teeth indicate they were leaf-eaters. They also went extinct during the Great Extinction Event at the end of the Ice Age, or, as it's called in Australia, the Big Dry. With the discovery of banded hair wallabies, science thought it had found a lone survivor of this enigmatic group. These animals had once been common on the mainland, but with the introduction of cats, foxes and dogs by Europeans, the species, along with hundreds of others, were hunted into extinction. First described by the French explorers, Perron and Lazoua, these wallabies are likely the raccoons Dampier mentioned catching when they first arrived in Shark Bay, as they have similar markings to the American animals. Only on these two islands in Shark Bay, sheltered from 2 centuries of carnage on the mainland, has the banded-haired wallaby survived into the modern world. Today, those studying the banded hair wallaby have had to pop everyone's balloon by pointing out the marsupial most likely is not a remnant population of strethorines. Instead, they have proven to be something far older. The banded hair wallaby has been placed in a new subfamily called the Lagostrophinae, meaning they're likely the species the strethorines and modern kangaroos diverged from. They are the surviving ancestors of both groups. Refreshed, Dampier travelled around New Guinea, charting many islands and reefs. With the shape of one looking so much like home, he named it New Britain. He also continued collecting zoological specimens, including some giant clams that would be the end of many adventurers in old movies. Preparing to sail for the east coast of New Holland, Dampier's rotten ship started taking on water. Turning for home, the disintegrating Roebuck somehow made it into the South Atlantic, where the crew were rescued by a passing Royal Navy squadron. Dampier published the maps and charts he'd produced on the voyage, giving the world its first accurate look at the shore, trade winds and currents around Australia and the islands surrounding it. On his return, Dampier was court-martialed for cruelly imprisoning George Fisher in Brazil and docked his entire pay for the voyage. This punishment also deemed him unable to captain a Royal Navy vessel ever again. Dampier was angry at how he'd been treated and wrote about this in a second book, A Voyage to New Holland, bringing him to the attention of the Royal Society, with many members smitten with the privateer's work. John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, had helped train Dampier in some astronomical methods and was keen to receive the data collected during his voyage. Dampier also handed over his botanical specimens to Dr. John Woodward and John Ray, English botanists and paleontologists, whose publications inspired Darwin, Banks, and helped Linnaeus develop his taxonomy system. Woodward released a paper titled 1696 Brief Instructions for Making Observations and Collections in All Parts of the World in order to promote natural history. The good doctor later created the Woodwardian Professor of Geology in 1728, originally called the Professor of Fossils, at the University of Cambridge, a position still in place today. He was also one of the first to recognise fossils and rocks formed different strata in the ground, and that many fossils were formed at sea. These ideas were ridiculed at the time, but of course Woodward was correct. John Ray believed fossils were the remains of animals still living somewhere on the planet because God would never allow a species to go extinct. Bizarrely, he was partially correct, as many fossil species have been found still alive, especially around Australia, such as the stromatolites in Shark Bay. Dampier sailed from England, returning to the more profitable business of privateering as war with Spain and France was looming once more. In truth, much of the spark seems to have been knocked out of the relapsed pirate, as he would write little more about his travels and become a bitter, cantankerous drunk. Sponsored by numerous businessmen and, shockingly, members of the Royal Society, Dampier captained the 26-gun St. George, joined by the smaller 16-gun Cinque Ports. The plan was to capture Spanish treasure ships in the Atlantic and Pacific. The voyage was a disaster, with many inexperienced men arguing every order the captains of both ships gave. Still bitter from the Roebuck voyage, Dampier simply fired and dumped a series of men off the boats in quick succession. His handling of these disputes clearly did little to alleviate tensions on board. Things were looking grim as no treasure ship had been found, so Dampier moved his fleet off the coast of Mexico, hoping to catch the Manila treasure galleon, which they did catch sight of as it sailed away from them and disappeared over the horizon. With no rich prize left to take, Dampier sailed the disintegrating St. George across the Pacific to Indonesia, was thrown in jail under suspicion of being a pirate, was freed, and returned to London in 1707, having just completed a second circumnavigation of the globe. For months, the English newspapers reported rumours of great successes from the Dampier expedition, creating expectations in his investors that they were all going to be extremely rich. There's even a possibility some investors were murdered for the inheritance thought to be obtained by the voyage. Instead, what everyone involved got was a round of lawsuits and countersuits. Third time's the charm. In 1708, William Dampier found himself approached by a new privateering outfit led by Woodes Rogers, future governor of the Bahamas. He intended to take two ships, the Duke and the Duchess, to raid Spanish shipping and then into the Pacific to capture the scheduled Manila treasure galleon. Though he wouldn't be a captain, Dampier signed on as the expedition's navigator with the promise of a 1/16th share on anything taken. Both ships sailed from England. Unfortunately, the crew turned out to be a mutinous rabble who argued every single order. With little luck on the Atlantic side, the ships entered the Pacific, where the experienced Dampier took over to take the Manila treasure galleon. Like his last voyage, Dampier explained the best place to catch it was off the Californian coast. Both ships were soon laying in wait for the Spanish treasure ship, yet after a month believed they'd missed it. Just as trouble was brewing on both ships between the officers and crew, a sail was spotted on the horizon. The privateers gave chase, with the Duke exchanging broadsides with the Spaniard. The pirates' smaller cannons proved quicker to reload and fire, and pummeled the galleon into submission. The Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación de Sengano had been travelling with the Manila galleon, but had become separated during a storm. The disappointed privateers realised this meant the treasure ship was still somewhere in the region, giving them one last chance. Rogers had been shot in the cheek during the fight, losing several teeth. He managed to write his orders, though, and they set sail for the galleon, which they miraculously found. The Nuestra Señora de Begona turned out to be a 40-gun warship in the capable hands of experienced Spaniards. Still, Rogers and his boys gave it a go and were soundly spanked by the galleon for their efforts. Dozens of pirates were dead, and Rogers was wounded again. The chase was called off, and the Manila galleon sailed away into the sunset. Returning to the captured Disengano, disappointment turned to joy when they did a careful search and discovered she was carrying at least 150,000 pounds in treasure and goods. That would be roughly 60 million today. The pirates were rich, and Dampier, after numerous attempts, had finally captured a Spanish treasure ship. Everyone headed home, though their troubles were far from over. Stopping in Batavia, the old Duchess was sold, while many became ill and started dying. One pirate, taking a quick dip in the ocean from the heat of the Dutch colony, was bitten in half by a shark. The expedition returned to England, and more litigation, as the treasure was fought over by investors and the crew. This mattered little to Dampier as, now in his 60s with failing eyesight and a failing memory, he retired before dying in 1715, years before those disputes were cleared up. Inspiration. Though the man was dead, Dampier's legend lived on as his numerous books continued to sell, inspiring a new crop of naturalists and explorers, using his books as a map to guide their way. Captain James Cook and Lord Horatio Nelson were students of his sailing and navigational techniques, with Nelson noting that any junior officer should read Dampier's work on winds to become a better sailor. The pirate's work on winds and his maps of ocean currents led him to be the first to link the two, and was of such quality that some sailors were still using them in the 19th century. A young Charles Darwin and Alexander von Humboldt continually quoted the buccaneer and used the skills he taught to help produce their own books. Darwin called Dampier's work a mine of information, while Humboldt called him the finest of all travel writers. It was in these books that Dampier introduced many words to the English language, making him second only to William Shakespeare to do so. The Oxford lists about 1,000, all told, such as avocado, barbecue, cashew, breadfruit, kumquat, excursion, chickpeas, chopsticks, rambling, thundercloud, and subspecies. Perhaps you've used a few of them. Remember the Cinque ports from Dampier's second voyage? At the Juan Fernandez archipelago, her captain got into a heated argument with Alexander Selkirk, the ship's Scottish sailing master. Selkirk was concerned about the ship's condition and argued it needed urgent repairs. The captain felt he knew better and sailed on, leaving Selkirk behind on one unsinkable island. The Cinque ports later sank, taking most of her crew with her. Selkirk only lived along the island's seashore for some time, as strange noises from the interior had him fearing he wasn't alone. When amorous sea lions started beaching themselves, Selkirk headed inland and discovered the noises had been from feral goats and a few cats, which he tamed to help keep rats from biting him during the long, dark nights. In 1709, with supplies running low on the Duke, Dampier set course for the deserted Juan Fernandez Islands. Here the crew was surprised to see smoke rising from a large bonfire set on one beach. Rowing to the island, the privateers found a hairy man jumping up and down insanely, covered in goatskins and, quote, wilder than the first owners of them. This man managed to stammer out marooned repeatedly, and 4 years and 4 months after being left behind, Alexander Selkirk had been rescued. Dampier discovered his old shipmate had built 2 houses, fashioned clothes out of goatskin and tools out of whatever he could find. Lean and shoeless, Selkirk was extremely fit and agile, capable of bounding across the rocks to catch the nimble goats with little trouble. Doing exactly this to the open-mouthed wonder of the buccaneers, Selkirk soon caught enough meat to feed the starving crews of both the Duke and Duchess. Later, Selkirk's story became the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and this wasn't the only time Dampier was connected to a literary masterpiece either. Jonathan Swift noted his own traveller, Lemuel Gulliver, was the cousin of Dampier, while the Yahoos were likely based on Dampier's description of Australian Aborigines. In fact, at the start of the book, Gulliver was sailing for Tasmania, and by his directions, Lilliput would have been roughly where Adelaide is today. In 1797, Samuel Taylor Coleridge partly based his protagonist in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner on Dampier and a pirate called Simon Hatley, who'd shot an albatross on a British privateering mission into the Pacific. After shooting the bird, the Shelvocke expedition hit a storm and was shipwrecked on an island called Mas a Tierra. 6 months later, the survivors built a new ship and continued on their way. Today, Mas a Tierra is known by another name, Robinson Crusoe Island, as this is the exact same island Selkirk had been dumped on. Jules Verne, in his book on great exploration, devoted an entire chapter to the pirate Dampier, who he dubbed a sea king of the 17th century. Dampier's expeditions also heavily influenced Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, as the cook that sailed with Dampier on the Duke was a one-legged pirate named John Silver. This expedition also visited the Galapagos. And to prove these volcanic rocks in the southern Pacific really do hold some magical influence over people, to ponder just how life appeared. Dampier reported it was odd how all the wildlife they saw were either birds or reptiles, with no beast read that as mammal walking their surface. His partner Rogers also noted in his journal that the iguanas and tortoises were so land-based that he questioned exactly how they'd got there in the first place, as they couldn't swim. William Dampier was a tenaciously inquisitive man, whose work helped blow away the myths and legends of many of the places he visited, leaving behind a world full of real wonders. It's a crime that the Englishman who visited Australia twice, decades before Captain Cook, the man who introduced more words to the English language than anyone else except William Shakespeare, the pirate and explorer who inspired some of the most important sailors, explorers, naturalists, and stories ever told, has almost been forgotten. To this, we can turn to the pirate himself when Dampier noted, "The world is apt to judge of everything by the success, and whoever has ill fortune will hardly be allowed a good name."